Hi there. Welcome to Dreamy Histories channel. Tonight we're going to slip beneath the dark waters of the North Sea, where dragon-headed ships once carved through fog like knives through silk. You're standing on a windswept monastery cliff, salt spray stinging your face, when you spot those distinctive square sails emerging from the dawn mist. Your blood runs cold because you know exactly what those ships mean. And honestly, if you were actually there, you probably wouldn't survive long enough to tell anyone about it. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment telling me where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love knowing that someone in Tokyo might be having breakfast while someone in New York is trying to fall asleep to tales of ancient terror. All right, let's begin the story. You hear them before you see them properly. The rhythmic splash of oars cutting through water, the creak of rope against wood, the low murmur of voices speaking in that harsh northern tongue. The year could be 793, could be 850, could be any summer morning during those centuries when the sight of a Viking longship meant your peaceful world was about to shatter like ice under a hammer. You're one of those monks at Lindisfarne, maybe, or a fisherman's daughter in Ireland, or a merchant in Francia counting silver coins in your warehouse. Doesn't matter who you are, when those ships appear, you're all equal in your terror. The mainstream history books tell you Vikings started raiding Britain in 793, with the attack on Lindisfarne Monastery. What they don't mention is that Scandinavian sea raiders had been making smaller, undocumented strikes for decades before, testing defenses, learning coastlines, perfecting their terror tactics on isolated communities whose screams never made it into any chronicle. Historians still argue whether these early ghost raids were organized military reconnaissance or just opportunistic pirates who stumbled onto something bigger than they'd imagined. You watch the first warriors leap from their ships into the shallows. And here's something your local priest never told you. Many of these men are wearing their finest clothes, their best jewelry, their hair carefully braided and beards groomed with expensive oils. See? Vikings dress for battle like they're going to a wedding, because in their minds, dying gloriously in combat is a celebration. They want to look good for the Valkyries who'll supposedly carry them to Valhalla, kind of like showing up to your own funeral in your best suit, except you're still moving and carrying a very large axe. The terror these sea kings inspire isn't just about their violence, though there's plenty of that coming. It's about their complete unpredictability. Your stone walls mean nothing when they can appear from any direction water touches. Your prayers mean nothing to gods they don't recognize. Your gold means everything, but your life? That depends entirely on their mood, the weather, and whether their leader woke up feeling generous or genocidal. You're learning what coastal communities all around Europe are about to discover. The sea itself has turned against you, and it has dragon-headed teeth. The mist clears enough for you to make out the lead ship's banner, a raven, black against white cloth, and your stomach drops because you've heard the stories. This is one of the sons of Ragnar Lothbrok, and not just any son. This is Ivar, the one they call Boneless, and if the tales are true, he's the most dangerous cripple who ever lived. You watch his men lift him from the ship. Yes, lift him. Because Ivar the Boneless can't walk, possibly can't even stand. Yet somehow he's conquered more kingdoms than most men with working legs ever dream of visiting. The historical sources can't agree on why they called him boneless. Maybe he had brittle bone disease. Maybe he was paralyzed from the waist down. Maybe he was just incredibly flexible, like some kind of murderous contortionist. The Saxon Chronicle describes him being carried into battle on a shield. directing his forces like some kind of strategic genius playing chess with human pieces. What's truly unsettling is how his disability made him more terrifying, not less. While his brothers relied on brute strength, Ivar had to develop his mind into a weapon sharper than any sword. You're watching his men arrange him on his specially constructed stretcher, though stretcher doesn't do it justice. This thing is more like a mobile command center, built with ash wood and iron fittings, designed so 4 warriors can carry their leader while he shoots arrows and shouts orders. The quirky historical tidbit that never makes it into the serious textbooks. Ivar supposedly had his carriers trained to move in perfect synchronization, creating what witnesses described as an 8-legged war beast that seemed to glide across battlefields. Imagine being charged by what looks like a giant spider with a psychopathic human torso for a head. His brothers might be the muscle, Bjorn with his legendary strength, Sigurd with his supernatural birthmarks, Vitzuk with his berserker rages, but Ivar is the brain. And brains are what turn random violence into systematic conquest. You watch him surveying your town from his elevated position, those pale eyes calculating angles of attack, counting defenders, noting where the wealthy houses cluster. He's not here for a quick raid, he's here to stay. The transformation from hit-and-run raids to actual conquest, that's Ivar's innovation. Earlier, Vikings grabbed what they could carry and ran back to their ships. Ivar grabs entire kingdoms and makes them pay him to not burn everything down, then comes back next year for another payment. He's basically invented the protection racket about 1,000 years before Al Capone made it fashionable. Historians still argue whether Ivar's strategic genius came from his disability, forcing him to think rather than just fight, or whether he would have been a mastermind regardless of his physical condition. You hear him speaking now, his voice carrying despite what must be considerable pain. Every historical account mentions he was in constant agony from whatever condition affected his bones. He's dividing your town into sections, assigning each to different warrior groups, discussing which buildings to preserve for winter quarters. Oh yes, that's another Ivar innovation. Why sail home for winter when you can just take someone else's home? His great heathen army will spend the next decade moving through England like a plague with a really good organizational chart, taking cities not through single devastating attacks, but through sustained psychological warfare that breaks spirits before bodies. The most unsettling part, he's maybe 25 years old. This strategic mastermind who's about to reshape the political map of England, who'll make kings kneel and saints weep, who'll turn the mere mention of Vikings from a scary story into an existential crisis. He's young enough to be your son. Except your son probably can't coordinate the movements of 3,000 bloodthirsty warriors while being carried around like luggage. That's what makes Ivar special. That's what makes him absolutely terrifying. You're still processing the horror of Ivar's arrival when another ship glides up beside his, and the warrior who steps out makes your blood run even colder. This one moves like a normal man, 2 functioning legs, no need for carriers, but there's something deeply wrong with his left eye. As he turns to survey your town, you see it clearly. The pupil is shaped like a serpent, a dark snake coiled in the white of his eye, seemingly alive and watching. This is Sigurd's snake in the eye, Ivar's brother, and if you believe in omens, his very existence is one. The sagas say he was born with this mark, that when baby Sigurd first opened his eyes, his mother Aslaug gasped and nearly dropped him. The snake in his eye was supposedly a sign from the gods, a prophecy written in flesh that this child would bring terror from the seas. The mainstream historical interpretation suggests he probably had a coloboma, a fairly common eye defect that creates irregular pupil shapes. But try explaining modern ophthalmology to terrified villagers, watching a man with a literal serpent in his eye commanding longships full of killers. What the sanitized histories don't tell you is how Sigurd used this deformity as psychological warfare. He'd learned to angle his head just right, so torchlight would catch that serpentine pupil, making it seem to writhe and move. Veterans of his raids reported having nightmares about that eye for years afterward, seeing it in dark water, in coiled rope, in the patterns of smoke from their burning homes. One Irish chronicle mentions him standing perfectly still during negotiations, letting people stare at his eye until they became so unnerved they'd agree to anything just to make him blink. You watch him consulting with Ivar, and the contrast between brothers is striking, where Ivar must be carried. Sigurd prowls the beach like his namesake snake, fluid and unpredictable, where Ivar commands through strategic brilliance. Sigurd leads through pure supernatural intimidation. He's checking the tide tables, not the written kind, because Vikings navigate by memory and instinct, but the kind written in the pull of water against his ship's hulls. See, Sigurd's particular genius lies in reading the sea itself. Historians still argue whether his reported ability to predict storms and find hidden currents was genuine meteorological talent, or just really good luck combined with intimidating marketing. The quirky detail that rarely makes it into serious academic work. Sigurd supposedly kept a collection of preserved snake eyes in a pouch around his neck, gifts from every serpent he'd killed since childhood. When he needed to make a particularly strong impression, he'd dump them out onto a table, dozens of tiny preserved eyes surrounding his own mark to gaze. It's the kind of detail that sounds too theatrical to be true, until you remember these are the same people who named their swords and gave them genealogies. Now Sigurd's giving orders in that low, measured voice that somehow carries over wind and wave. Unlike Ivar's complex tactical arrangements, Sigurd's commands are simple. Take everything that floats, burn everything that doesn't, leave the church standing. That last part makes you hope briefly. Maybe there's mercy in him. Then you realize he's keeping it intact because churches make excellent slave-holding pens, and hope dies faster than a candle in a storm. The brothers work in terrible harmony. Ivar identifies the strategic targets. Sigurd ensures the naval logistics. Ivar plans the land campaigns. Sigurd controls the sea routes that make them possible. You're watching the birth of coordinated amphibious warfare, centuries before military academies will teach it as doctrine. Between the boneless strategist and the snake-eyed sailor, your entire world is caught in a pincer movement that started the moment their father Ragnar died in that Northumbrian snake pit. That's the thing about killing a legend. His sons tend to take it personally, and they've got the naval capacity to express their displeasure across every coastline in Christendom. The morning sun climbs higher, burning off the last of the mist. And now you can see the full fleet spread across your harbour like a disease. Among the dragon ships, one stands out, not for its size, though it's massive, but for the strange decorations along its hull. Those aren't the usual carved serpents and snarling beasts. They're octopi, dolphins, Mediterranean creatures that have no business on a Nordic longship. The man standing at its prow wears Byzantine silk under his chainmail, and when he smiles, you glimpse teeth studded with African gold. This is Bjorn Ironside, and he's about to explain why Vikings aren't just a northern problem anymore. The name Ironside supposedly came from his ability to take wounds that would drop a normal man and keep fighting like nothing happened. The mainstream historical record confirms he raided along the Mediterranean from 859 to 862, reaching as far as North Africa and possibly even Italy. What those dry chronicles don't capture is the sheer audacity of taking wooden ships built for cold northern waters and sailing them through the Strait of Gibraltar into seas most Vikings had only heard about in traders' tales. It's like taking a snowmobile to the Sahara and somehow making it work. You're watching Bjorn's men unload plunder that makes no sense. Roman marble statues, Moorish carpets, what looks like an entire Byzantine chapel's worth of golden crosses. The unexpected historical detail. Bjorn's Mediterranean raids weren't primarily about wealth. He was apparently obsessed with proving that Viking ships could go anywhere water touched, that no coast was safe, no sea too distant. His men reported he would stand at the prow during storms, arms spread wide, laughing at waves that should have terrified any sane sailor. Some historians argue he was establishing trade routes. Others think he just wanted to see how far south he could go before the sun melted his Nordic blood. But here's what makes Bjorn truly terrifying. He learned from everyone he raided. Those Byzantine tactics for using Greek fire, he adapted them for ship-to-ship combat. Those Moorish navigation techniques using stars the Norse had never named, he memorized them. That Roman engineering for harbour fortifications, he figured out how to break them. You're not just facing a Viking raider anymore. You're facing someone who's collected the military wisdom of 3 continents and distilled it into pure maritime terror. The locals who've dealt with him before are already whispering the stories. How he convinced the defenders of Luna that he'd converted to Christianity on his deathbed, got them to carry his corpse into the city for a Christian burial, then jumped out of the coffin with a sword. How he navigated the Guadalquivir River to sack Seville, something the locals swore was impossible for ships that size. How his men came back from raids speaking fragments of Arabic, Greek, and Latin, wearing clothes from cultures they couldn't even name. Bjorn turned his fleet into a floating university of violence, where the only subject taught was how to make people afraid in every language. You notice something else about his ships. They sit lower in the water than the others, modified somehow. Later, survivors will report that Bjorn had learned to adjust his vessel's draft by installing what he called Mediterranean bellies, removable hull extensions that could be attached or detached depending on whether he was navigating shallow rivers or deep ocean. It's the kind of innovation that sounds simple until you realize he's essentially created modular warships 8 centuries before anyone else will think of it. Historians still argue whether these modifications were real or just another layer of mythology added to an already impossible story. The irony that probably escapes you in your terror is that Bjorn Ironside, this unstoppable force who turned the warm Mediterranean into his personal raiding pool, will die in his bed as a wealthy king. Unlike his brothers who'll meet violent ends, Bjorn will prove that sometimes the most dangerous Vikings are the ones smart enough to know when to stop pushing their luck. But that's years away. Right now, he's here with ships full of multicultural plunder and men who've learned to be terrifying in ways your little northern town has never imagined. The sun reaches its zenith, and you're starting to think maybe you've seen the worst of it when a commotion erupts near the lead ships. Warriors are backing away from a figure emerging from below deck, and even these hardened killers look unsettled. The man who appears is older than the sons of Ragnar, grey streaking his long beard, but he moves with the easy confidence of someone who survived more battles than most men ever see. This is Hastein, sometimes called Hasting in the Anglo-Saxon chronicles, and he's carrying what looks like a funeral shroud. If Ivar is the strategic genius and Bjorn the explorer, Hastein is the con artist, the trickster who turned psychological warfare into an art form. The mainstream history remembers him as co-leader of Bjorn's Mediterranean expedition. But what they gloss over is that Halstein basically invented the Viking equivalent of performance art. His specialty, faking his own death to get inside walled cities. Not once, not twice, but according to various chronicles, at least 4 times in different locations. You'd think people would catch on, but apparently, a dead Viking is such good news that nobody wants to question it too closely. The quirky historical detail that academics tend to skip. Halstein travelled with a personal makeup artist, a thrall who'd been a Byzantine theatre performer before his capture. This slave's entire job was to make Halstein look convincingly deceased using a mixture of flour, ash, and what one source delicately describes as grave oils. The performance was elaborate. Halstein would practice holding his breath for extended periods, slowing his heartbeat through meditation techniques learned from Eastern merchants, even allowing his limbs to be positioned in rigor mortis-like poses. Witnesses describe feeling genuinely unsettled by how corpse-like he could appear. You watch him conferring with the other leaders, gesturing at your town's modest walls with obvious disdain. He's probably calculating whether your defenses warrant the full death performance or if a simpler ruse will suffice. See, Halstein's true innovation wasn't just the fake funeral trick. It was understanding that every fortification has a psychological weakness. Walls keep out warriors, but they don't keep out grief, religious obligation, or the human tendency to let your guard down when you think the danger has passed. He's weaponized empathy itself. The most disturbing part of Halstein's methods is how they corrupt sacred customs. That funeral you'll hold for your father next winter? You'll remember Halstein and wonder if the body is really dead. That traveling merchant who claims to be Christian and asks for sanctuary. You'll think of Halstein and bar the gates. He's not just raiding your town. He's poisoning the social contracts that make civilization possible. Historians still argue whether his tactics contributed to the general breakdown of trust between communities during the Viking Age, or if he was just exploiting suspicions that already existed. But here's the twist. Halstein is also genuinely religious, just not in any way you'd recognize. He carries tiny silver hammers representing Thor, bronze ravens for Odin, and, weirdly, a collection of Christian crosses taken from various churches, not as trophies, but as what he apparently considers backup divine insurance. His men report he prays to all gods before his fake death performances, asking them to make the deception convincing, but also to not actually take him by mistake. It's a theological hedge fund managed by a serial blasphemer who's somehow convinced that all deities appreciate good theatre. Now he's examining your church through a pilfered Byzantine telescope. Yes, Vikings have those now, thanks to raiders like him bringing back souvenirs from advanced civilizations. He's noting the position of your cemetery, the width of your church doors, the daily patterns of your religious services. In about 3 days, word will spread that the terrible Viking chief Halstein has been mortally wounded in a skirmish, and in 5 days, his dying wish to be buried in consecrated ground will reach your bishop's ears. In a week, you'll be carrying his coffin through those church doors, and by then, it'll be far too late to realize your mistake. The death shroud he's holding isn't for covering a corpse, it's for measuring doorways. As the Viking leaders continue their terrible planning session on your beach, you notice something that makes your skin crawl. They keep mentioning their father, Ragnar, with a reverence that borders on the religious. Every few sentences, one of them touches an amulet or makes a gesture toward the north, where Northumbria lies. You've heard the story. Of course, everyone has. how King Ella captured the legendary Ragnar Lothbrok and threw him into a pit of venomous snakes, leaving him to die in writhing agony. What you're only now beginning to understand is that Ella didn't just kill a Viking raider. He created a revenge saga that would drown England in blood. The mainstream historical sources tell us Ragnar probably died around 865, though they can't agree if he was even a real person or an amalgamation of several Viking leaders. What they do agree on is that his supposed death triggered the arrival of the great heathen army, the largest Viking force ever assembled, led by his sons and fueled by a thirst for vengeance that would reshape Britain forever. But here's what the dry chronicles don't convey: the psychological impact of the snake pit execution on the Viking imagination. It wasn't just cruel, it was symbolically perfect for creating a martyrdom cult. Snakes, you see, occupy a special place in Norse mythology. The world serpent, Jörmungandr, encircles Midgard. The dragon Nidogr gnaws at the roots of Yggdrasil. Snakes are creatures of fate, of cycles, of inevitable doom. By killing Ragnar with snakes, Ella accidentally cast him as a mythological figure, someone whose death was written in the coils of destiny itself. The quirky detail historians often miss. Viking skalds reported that Ragnar died laughing, composing death poetry about how his sons would avenge him. Whether true or not, the image of a man joking with snakes poisoning his blood became the ultimate expression of Viking fatalism. You're watching these sons now, and you can see how their father's death has transformed them from successful raiders into something far more dangerous, true believers in a cause. Ivar touches the ivory gaming piece he supposedly carved from one of the snake pit's victims. Bjorn absently fingers a fang he wears on a leather cord. Sigurd's serpent eye seems to pulse with renewed meaning. Even Vitzek and Ubbe, the brothers you haven't met yet, are defined by this event. They're not here for gold anymore, or even for conquest. They're here to make the world pay for putting their father in that pit. The thing about revenge in Viking culture is that it's not emotional, it's mathematical. Every slight must be balanced, every death paid for, preferably with interest. Historians still argue whether the brutality of the great heathen army's campaigns was unusual for Vikings or simply better documented. But survivors' accounts suggest a level of systematic cruelty that went beyond typical raiding. They weren't just killing warriors, they were destroying entire bloodlines, erasing dynasties, ensuring that King Ella's mistake would echo through generations. But here's the truly terrifying part. Ragnar might have planned this. Some sagas suggest he deliberately got himself captured, knowing his death would unite his quarrelsome sons and give them a cause greater than their petty rivalries. Imagine being so committed to destroying your enemies that you'd use your own agonizing death as a weapon. It's like a suicide bombing, except instead of explosives, you're detonating your children's rage across an entire nation. Whether Ragnar was that calculating or just got lucky in his unlucky death, the result is the same. England is about to experience what happens when you kill a legend and leave his offspring alive. You can hear them now, swearing oaths to their dead father, promising to find every person who laughed when they heard about the snake pit, everyone who supplied the snakes, everyone who failed to protest the execution. The great heathen army isn't just a military force. It's a grudge given flesh and steel and ships. And the worst part, King Ella is already dead, executed by Ivar using something called the Blood Eagle, which, well, let's just say it makes a snake pit look like mercy. But one dead king isn't enough to balance the scales. Not nearly enough. The afternoon sun glints off armor and weapons as more ships arrive. And you spot a vessel flying Byzantine purple alongside Norse ravens. The man who disembarks wears scale mail that catches light like fish skin, and his beard is braided with gold threads in the Constantinople fashion. This is Harold Hardredder, Harold the Hard Ruler, though right now he's just another ambitious warrior in this terrifying assembly. You don't know it yet, but you're looking at a future king of Norway who'll earn his crown through sheer, calculated brutality, after spending his youth as the medieval equivalent of a special forces operator in the Byzantine emperor's service. The mainstream history books love to focus on Harold's later invasion of England in 1066, where he'd die at Stamford Bridge just days before William the Conqueror arrived. What they skip over is his absolutely insane career as a Varangian guard in Constantinople, basically a Viking mercenary in the world's richest city, learning torture techniques from people who'd elevated cruelty to an art form. The Byzantine Empire didn't just execute enemies. They had a whole bureaucracy dedicated to creative punishment. Harold spent 15 years there taking notes. You watch him demonstrating something to the other Vikings using small silver coins, arranging them in patterns on a shield. Later, survivors will realize he was showing them Byzantine Greek fire deployment tactics, how to use incendiary weapons not just to burn ships, but to create psychological terror through seemingly supernatural flames that water couldn't extinguish. The quirky historical detail. Harold supposedly kept a pet Greek engineer, a eunuch named Stephanos, who traveled with him everywhere and whose only job was to devise new ways to make fire do horrible things. Vikings were already scary. Vikings with flamethrowers were apocalyptic. What makes Harold different from the other sea kings is his peculiar combination of savage brutality and sophisticated cunning. He speaks 6 languages fluently, can read Latin and Greek, understands mathematics well enough to calculate siege engine trajectories, and once reportedly resolved a dispute over raid shares using abstract algebra. He's like finding out your barbarian invader has a PhD from Harvard. Historians still argue whether his intelligence made him more or less brutal than his peers. Does understanding civilization make you better at destroying it? Or does it give you some appreciation for what you're burning? The Byzantine court chronicles, written by people who had no reason to flatter a Norse mercenary, describe Harold as uncommonly tall even for a Viking, with one eyebrow set higher than the other, giving him a perpetually sardonic expression. They also mention his habit of composing poetry while killing people, literally making up verses between sword strokes. It's the kind of detail that sounds like medieval propaganda until you realize the Vikings really did consider poetry a martial art. A warrior who couldn't compose skaldic verse was like a knight who couldn't ride a horse. Technically possible, but professionally embarrassing. Right now, Harold is explaining to Ivar something about Byzantine prison design, using words your language doesn't even have. Concepts like psychological architecture and calculated despair. See, in Constantinople, they'd figured out how to build dungeons that broke men's minds before touching their bodies, using tricks of light, sound, and space to create environments where reality itself seemed hostile. Harold's suggesting they could adapt these principles to longship design, creating vessels that would terrify enemies before the Vikings even disembarked. It's the kind of innovation that happens when you cross-pollinate cultures through the medium of organized violence. You're starting to understand that this gathering isn't just about Ragnar's revenge anymore. It's become a kind of Viking think tank, where the worst people from across the known world are sharing their worst ideas. Harold's Byzantine experiences, Bjorn's Mediterranean insights, Hastein's theatrical innovations, Ivar's strategic genius. They're creating a synthesis of terror that no single culture could have produced. When historians argue about whether the Viking Age represented a dark age or a period of cultural exchange, they're both right. It's just that the culture being exchanged is the culture of more efficient brutality. The planning session breaks up as the leaders disperse to their ships, but one figure remains on the beach, standing alone like a blood-soaked monument. This one's different from the others, where they move with purpose and calculation. He radiates pure, unfocused violence. His men give him a wide berth, and even the other leaders seem wary. This is Eric Bloodaxe, and his name isn't metaphorical. The axe hanging at his side is crusted with what looks suspiciously like dried blood, and nobody's brave enough to suggest he clean it. Eric's claim to infamy in the mainstream histories is that he became King of Norway at his father Harald Fairhair's death, ruled so brutally that his own people drove him out, fled to England, became King of Northumbria, and got driven out of there too. It takes special talent to be too violent for Vikings. What those sanitized accounts don't capture is the sheer, exhausting terror of being around someone who might kill you, not for profit or revenge, but because you breathe too loudly during his morning prayers. The quirky historical detail that rarely makes it into the serious books. Eric supposedly suffered from what his contemporaries called the blood madness, periods where he'd lose all ability to distinguish friend from foe, ally from enemy, his own men from targets. Modern historians suggest he might have had intermittent explosive disorder, or some form of temporal lobe epilepsy that manifested as uncontrollable rage. His solution was characteristically Viking. He had his men tie a red cloth around his arm when they sensed an episode coming on, a signal that meant run in whatever direction the king isn't facing. You're watching him now as he methodically sharpens that infamous axe, and the sound carries across the beach like fingernails on slate. His own sagas, and yes, even Eric Bloodaxe had scolds, though they had the most dangerous job in medieval literature. Describe him killing 18 of his own brothers to secure his throne, not rivals or half-brothers with competing claims, but full siblings who made the mistake of existing while Eric wanted to be king. Historians still argue whether this was exceptional even by Viking standards of dynastic murder, or just better documented than similar family purges. What made Eric truly terrifying wasn't just his violence, but his complete unpredictability. Other Viking leaders killed for reasons: wealth, revenge, strategy, even sport. Eric killed like breathing, automatically and without thought. Veterans of his raids reported finding him after battles covered in blood and genuinely unable to remember how many people he'd killed or why. He'd ask his men to count the bodies and tell him stories of his own actions, like a drunk trying to piece together the previous night. Except instead of embarrassing dance moves, he was reconstructing massacres. But here's the truly unsettling part. Between his blood rages, Eric was apparently a competent administrator and lawgiver. He established trade routes, built fortifications, even patronized poets and artists. It's like finding out your serial killer neighbor runs an excellent daycare when he's not murdering people. The cognitive dissonance broke something in the medieval mind. How could someone be a good king and a monster? The answer, which nobody wanted to acknowledge, was that maybe being a monster was part of being a king in this world. You notice the other Vikings treating him with a mixture of respect and revulsion, like a powerful but rabid dog. They need his capacity for violence, but they're clearly calculating how to point him at enemies rather than allies. Even Ivar, who orchestrates brutality like a composer writing symphonies, looks uncomfortable around Eric. There's controlled violence, and then there's whatever Eric represents. Violence as a force of nature, as inevitable and unreasoning as a storm. When the red cloth goes around his arm during your town sacking, you'll understand why even his own men flee. Some weapons are too dangerous for anyone to wield safely, but that doesn't stop Vikings from trying. As dusk approaches, painting the sky the color of blood and gold, a new fleet appears on the horizon. These ships move differently, more organized, more disciplined, flying banners that mix Norse dragons with something else, crosses. On Viking ships, the man who steps ashore wears a crown, an actual golden crown, and his beard is forked into 2 points that make him look like a well-groomed demon. This is Sweyn Forkbeard, and he's about to demonstrate that Vikings have learned the ultimate raiding technique, becoming the legitimate government. The mainstream histories record that Sweyn Forkbeard became the first Viking to successfully conquer all of England, ruling as its king from Christmas 1013 until his death weeks later. What they don't emphasize enough is the psychological warfare campaign that made it possible. Sweyn didn't conquer England with axes and swords. He conquered it with terror so precisely calculated that towns surrendered at the mere rumor of his approach. He turned intimidation into a science, complete with mathematical formulas for how many examples to make versus how many survivors to leave to spread the word. You watch him conferring with the other leaders, and there's something unsettlingly corporate about his approach. Where Eric Bloodaxe is chaotic violence, and Ivar is strategic brutality, Sweyn is violence as a business model. He actually carries what looks like ledgers, keeping track of which regions have paid tribute, which have resisted, which might need a reminder of why paying the Danegeld is preferable to the alternative. The quirky historical detail. Sweyn reportedly employed a team of Saxon accountants, men who'd switched sides when they realized their mathematical skills were more valued by Vikings than by their own kings. Here's what makes Sweyn truly terrifying. He's figured out that you can conquer more with paperwork than with swords. His innovation was the systematization of the protection racket on a national scale. Instead of random raids, he offers consistent, predictable taxation. Instead of killing everyone, he leaves functioning governments in place under his control. Instead of burning churches, he attends Christmas Mass. He's not destroying civilization. He's performing a hostile takeover. Historians still argue whether Sweyn represents the evolution of Viking culture or its ultimate corruption. Is he the most successful Viking ever, or no longer truly Viking at all? The really disturbing part is how reasonable he makes surrender sound. His messengers, and yes, he has an actual diplomatic corps now, arrive at towns with meticulously calculated offers. Pay this much silver annually, provide these specific supplies, surrender these particular hostages, and your town continues to exist. Refuse, and well, they'll gesture vaguely toward whatever smoking ruin used to be the last town that refused. Its violence transformed into pure economics, terror reduced to a line item in a budget. You notice him examining your fortifications with the eye of someone calculating renovation costs. See, Sweyn doesn't destroy useful infrastructure. He conquers it, improves it, and adds it to his growing empire. Those walls you built to keep Vikings out, he's already planning how to garrison them with his own men to keep other Vikings out, competitors who might disrupt his carefully managed profit margins. He's basically invented the concept of Viking franchising, where his corporate headquarters and local strongmen are regional managers in the empire of systematized fear. The Christmas conquest detail that histories mention but don't fully explore. Sweyn specifically timed his final push to coincide with Christianity's holier season, not out of blasphemy, but from psychological calculation. He understood that nothing breaks a population's spirit, quite like having their sacred celebrations turned into surrender ceremonies. When English nobles knelt to crown him on Christmas Day, they weren't just acknowledging a conqueror. They were admitting their God had failed to protect them even on his own son's birthday. It's the kind of symbolic victory that echoes through generations, the kind of cultural trauma that shapes national identities. Right now, though, Sweyn is just another leader in this terrifying assembly, sharing his insights on efficient conquest with men who still prefer the old-fashioned kind of pillaging. But watch him carefully. In a few years, he'll demonstrate that the most dangerous Viking isn't the one who comes to raid your town. It's the one who comes to run it. The moon rises full and bright, turning the assembled Vikings into silver-edged shadows, when a giant emerges from the darkness between ships. Not metaphorically giant. This man stands at least 7 feet tall. Having to duck under the dragon-head prows, his arms are like tree trunks. His hands could palm your entire skull, and he's carrying what appears to be a ship's anchor as a walking stick. This is Thorkel the High, also called Thorkel the Tall, and he represents everything unstable about Viking loyalty, which is to say, all of it. The mainstream histories can't quite figure out what to do with Thorkel. He switches sides so often that chroniclers need flowcharts to track his allegiances. First, he's fighting for Sweyn Forkbeard. Then he's defending London against Sweyn for the English king Ethelred. Then he's back with the Danes under Canute. Then, maybe he's rebelling again. Honestly, even Thorkel probably lost track. What the formal histories miss is that his constant betrayals weren't seen as dishonorable by Viking standards. He was simply following the money and glory wherever they led, like a very large, very dangerous free agent in the medieval warfare market. The quirky detail that rarely makes it into academic texts. Thorkel supposedly suffered from a condition his men called height madness, periodic confusion caused by the thin air up where his head resided. Whether this was altitude sickness, a circulation issue, or just Vikings trying to explain why their giant commander kept forgetting which side he was on. The result was a warrior whose tactical brilliance was matched only by his strategic inconsistency. You never knew if Thorkel would defend your city to the death or suddenly remember he'd been offered more silver to burn it down. You watch him now, having to sit on a specially reinforced ship's chest while the other leaders stand. And even seated, he's looking most of them in the eye. His mere physical presence warps the dynamics of any gathering. Warriors who cheerfully charge a shield wall think twice about disagreeing with someone who could literally break them in half one-handed. But here's the thing about Thorkel. He's not just large, he's skilled. Imagine LeBron James if he'd been trained from birth in the art of axe murder. Historians still argue whether his famous defense of London Bridge was driven by loyalty to the English or just professional pride in holding an impossible position. What makes Thorkel truly dangerous isn't his size or skill, but his complete mercenary pragmatism combined with genuine tactical genius. He's credited with innovating the use of London Bridge itself as a weapon, turning its narrow span into a meat grinder where numbers meant nothing and his reach advantage meant everything. He'd switch sides mid-battle if someone made him a better offer, but he'd execute that betrayal with absolute professional excellence. It's like being stabbed in the back by someone who takes real pride in their knife work. The most unsettling aspect of Thorkel is how he makes betrayal seem reasonable, even admirable. He doesn't sneak or lie or make excuses. He announces his side switches publicly, often explaining the exact payment that bought his new loyalty. He'll even give his former employers advice on defending against him, though he'll charge them consulting fees for the privilege. He's turned treachery into transparency, making it somehow more honorable than secret loyalty. When your entire social system is based on personal oaths and blood bonds, someone who treats those bonds as renewable contracts is either a visionary or a monster, probably both. Right now, he's examining the other leaders with the calculating eye of someone deciding which alliance will be most profitable. Sweyn has the organization, Ivar has the strategy, Harold has the connections, Eric has the terrifying reputation. You can practically see him running cost-benefit analyses in his head, factoring in plunder potential versus survival probability. In a few hours, he'll make his choice and commit to it absolutely until a better offer comes along. That's the Thorkel guarantee. Complete dedication to whoever's currently paying him, with terms and conditions subject to change without notice. As the Viking assembly continues under moonlight, a ship arrives with distinctly different energy. Its crew sings, not the usual rough sailing songs, but something that sounds almost like a hymn. The man who disembarks wears a massive silver cross over his mail shirt, right next to a Thor's hammer amulet, and his sword's pommel is shaped like a crucifix. This is Olaf Tryggvason, and he represents perhaps the most terrifying Viking evolution yet, the convert with a mission. He's discovered Christianity, and he's going to share it with you whether you want it or not. Think of him as a door-to-door missionary if the missionary was 7 feet tall and the door was your entire kingdom. The mainstream histories paint Olaf as the king who Christianized Norway, but they tend to gloss over his conversion methods. Imagine someone explaining the love of Christ while holding a battle axe to your throat. Olaf's theological arguments were backed by what medieval scholars politely called vigorous persuasion, which usually meant choosing between baptism or having your lungs pulled out through your back. He turned spreading the gospel into a military campaign where souls were territory and conversion rates were measured in blood. You watch him arguing theology with some of the other Vikings, and it's surreal seeing these raiders debate the nature of the Trinity, the quirky historical detail. Olaf supposedly carried a portable baptismal font on his ship, a silver basin stolen from an English church, naturally, so he could perform immediate conversions during raids. Nothing says welcome to Christianity quite like being baptized in water mixed with your neighbor's blood. His crew included both traditional Viking warriors and what he called sword priests, clergymen who decided that turning the other cheek was optional when dealing with pagans. What made Olaf particularly dangerous was his absolute certainty that his violence was now sanctified. Other Vikings killed for profit, revenge, or pleasure. Olaf killed for God, which somehow made it worse. He developed elaborate theological justifications for everything from enslaving pagans, bringing them closer to salvation, to burning temples, removing temptation. Historians still argue whether his conversion was genuine religious experience or brilliant political strategy. Christianity gave him connections to European power structures and moral authority over traditional Viking leaders. Why be just another sea king when you could be God's own sea king? The really disturbing part is how effective his methods were. He'd sail into a fjord, announce that everyone had 3 days to accept Christ, and then systematically work through the population. Day 1. Preaching and reasonable discussion. Day 2. Property destruction and select examples. Day 3. Wholesale slaughter of anyone still wearing Thor's hammer. By day 4, you'd have a thoroughly Christian community. though one significantly smaller than it started. His success rate was nearly perfect, if you didn't count the deceased as failures. But here's what the histories often miss. Olaf's Christianity was unique. He'd grafted Norse warrior culture onto Christian theology in ways that would horrify actual theologians. His version of turning the other cheek meant hitting enemies from both sides. His interpretation of Fisher of Men involved actual nets and a lot more drowning than the apostles probably intended. Christ's message of love got translated into Old Norse as something closer to aggressive friendship enforcement. He wasn't so much converting Vikings to Christianity as converting Christianity to Vikings. You're watching him bless his weapons now, performing some ritual that combines Latin prayers with runic inscriptions. His men join in, creating this bizarre hybrid ceremony that would scandalize both Pope and pagan priest equally. Tomorrow, when he leads raids, he'll do it while singing psalms. He'll burn your pagan shrines in the name of the Prince of Peace. He'll explain Christ's mercy while showing none. It's cognitive dissonance weaponized into a worldview, and it's spreading through the Viking world like a particularly violent plague. Soon, you won't just have to worry about pagan Vikings coming to steal your gold. You'll have Christian Vikings coming to steal your soul. Somehow, that's worse. The assembly starts to break up as dawn approaches, but one more ship glides into the harbour, flying colours that make no sense. Irish green alongside Norse red, Celtic knotwork mixed with Viking dragons. The man who steps ashore is barefoot despite the cold morning, his legs painted with woad in Pictish patterns, his hair braided in the Irish style, but his beard forked like a proper Norseman. This is Magnus Barefoot, and he's having what might generously be called an identity crisis, though it's everyone else's problem. Magnus got his nickname not from poverty, but from his obsession with wearing kilts, or specifically, the Irish lane, instead of proper Norse trousers. The mainstream histories record him as King of Norway, who died trying to conquer Ireland in 1103. What they don't capture is his complete psychological absorption into Celtic culture, while simultaneously trying to subjugate it. He's like a colonial governor who's gone so native he forgets which side he's supposed to be colonizing for. It's cultural appropriation with extreme violence, the medieval equivalent of a weeb with an army. The quirky historical detail that academics tend to skip. Magnus reportedly travelled with a team of Irish bards whom he'd kidnapped and forced to compose praise poems about him in Gaelic. He'd sit through hours of Celtic genealogies trying to prove he was descended from ancient Irish kings, while his actual Irish subjects rolled their eyes and plotted rebellion. His men described him practicing Irish accents in his tent, trying to perfect the pronunciation of places he was actively burning down. Imagine Genghis Khan convinced he was actually Chinese, and you're getting close to Magnus's level of cultural confusion. You watch him directing his men in a mixture of Norse and badly accented Irish, and even his own warriors look confused. He's wearing more gold than a successful Viking should. Irish torques, Celtic brooches, arm rings with Ogham inscriptions he probably can't read. The disturbing part is how his Irish obsession makes him more dangerous, not less. He's studying Celtic warfare tactics with the dedication of an anthropologist and the resources of a conqueror. Those hit-and-run guerrilla tactics the Irish use against Vikings, he's teaching them to his Norse warriors. Those sacred sites the Irish defend to the death, he knows exactly where they are and why they matter. Here's what makes Magnus truly unsettling. He genuinely seems to believe he's more Irish than the Irish. He'll burn a monastery in the morning and then lecture the survivors about how they're not maintaining proper Celtic traditions He knows more Irish mythology than most Irish nobles, can recite lineages back to legendary figures, understands the symbolic importance of every hill and stream, but he uses this knowledge to destroy more efficiently, to target cultural weak points with surgical precision. Historians still argue whether Magnus represents the logical endpoint of Viking integration or its complete perversion. What happens when conquerors don't just want your land, but your identity too? The real tragedy of Magnus is that he might have succeeded in becoming Irish if he could have stopped trying to conquer Ireland. His fascination was genuine, his knowledge deep, his commitment total, but he couldn't separate appreciation from domination, couldn't love something without trying to own it, so he dies in Ireland, killed by the people he desperately wanted to become, wearing Irish clothes and speaking Irish words, and never understanding why they wouldn't accept him as one of their own. Maybe because he kept killing them. That might have been a factor. Right now, though, he's arguing with Olaf about whether Celtic Christianity is the true faith, and Norse Christianity is a corruption, or vice versa. It's the kind of theological debate that can only happen when both participants have completely lost track of what religion is supposed to be about. You're watching Vikings argue about the proper way to be Christian while planning raids on Christian communities. Magnus is insisting that Irish monks understand God better than Roman priests, apparently missing the irony that he's personally responsible for reducing Ireland's monk population by a significant percentage. It's like watching arsonists debate the best wood for building churches. The sun rises fully now, burning away the morning mist to reveal even more ships arriving, an entire second fleet flying the banners of Norway, but marked with crosses and strange symbols from the east. The man who commands them wears scale armor that glints like silver fish scales, and his cloak bears the emblem of Jerusalem itself. This is Sigurd the Crusader, called Sigurd Jorsalfar, and he represents the absolute final evolution of Viking raiding, holy war on an intercontinental scale. He's taken everything terrible about Viking warfare and gotten it officially blessed by the Pope. The mainstream histories celebrate Sigurd as the first European king to personally lead a crusade to the Holy Land, fighting Muslims in Iberia, the Mediterranean, and Palestine from 1107 to 1110. What they downplay is that Sigurd basically treated the entire crusade as an extended Viking raid with better public relations. While other crusaders were motivated by faith or feudal obligation, Sigurd saw it as an opportunity to plunder his way across 3 continents while calling it God's work. He's weaponized Christianity even more effectively than Olaf Tryggvason. At least Olaf stayed in northern waters. You watch him unloading cargo that makes no sense in this northern harbour. Cedar wood from Lebanon, spices from markets in Jerusalem, what looks like an actual piece of the true cross, or at least what some desperate merchant convinced him was the true cross. The quirky historical detail? Sigurd supposedly kept a detailed journal of every person he killed on crusade, organized by religion, nationality, and whether they died facing Mecca, Jerusalem, or just screaming in no particular theological direction. He treated it like a spiritual accounting ledger, convinced that each infidel death earned him points toward paradise. What makes Sigurd genuinely terrifying is how he's internationalized Viking violence. Earlier raiders were local problems. They'd hit your coast, take your gold, maybe occupy your land. Sigurd has connections from Norway to Constantinople to Jerusalem. He can call in favors from the Knights Templar. He has trade agreements with Italian merchant princes. He's turned Viking raiding from a seasonal occupation into a global enterprise with papal approval. Historians still argue whether his crusade was motivated by genuine faith or brilliant geopolitical strategy. Why limit yourself to raiding Christians when you can raid Muslims too, and have Christians thank you for it? The really disturbing part is how Sigurd has reframed traditional Viking activities as Christian virtues. Killing for gold is sin, but killing for God and taking their gold is virtue. Enslaving Christians is wrong, but enslaving Muslims is missionary work. You're bringing them closer to potential conversion. Burning churches is sacrilege, but burning mosques is devotion. He hasn't changed Viking behavior at all. He's just found a theological framework that makes it admirable instead of abhorrent. It's the most successful rebranding campaign in medieval history. But here's the twist that makes your blood run cold. Sigurd's ships aren't just carrying plunder from the Holy Land. They're carrying veterans of the Crusades, Norse warriors who've learned siege techniques from the Byzantines, cavalry tactics from the Turks, fortification methods from the greatest castle builders in the world. His men have fought in deserts, learned to navigate by stars the Norse never named, developed immunity to diseases that would devastate northern armies. They're not just Vikings anymore. They're Vikings with a graduate education in international warfare. You notice him conferring with the other leaders, and there's something unsettlingly modern about his approach. He's talking about supply lines through Venice, credit arrangements with Jewish bankers, intelligence networks maintained by traveling monks. While Eric Bloodaxe represents the violent past and Sweyn Forkbeard the organized present, Sigurd embodies the terrifying future, warfare as a multinational corporation with religious exemption from moral constraints. When he mentions casually that he's considering another Eastern expedition, this time perhaps to India, where he's heard there are Christians who need liberating from Hindu rule, you realize the Viking Age isn't ending, it's going global, and God help anyone who stands in the way of Christian Norse expansion. The dragons on those ships' prows are wearing halos now, and somehow that makes them worse. As the Great Assembly finally disperses, with longships spreading across the harbour like a disease preparing to infect the world, one final vessel remains anchored at the periphery. It's smaller than the others, almost modest, but something about it makes your skin crawl. The man lounging against its dragon prow doesn't look like a king or a legendary warrior. He's reading what appears to be a farming almanac, occasionally making notes with charcoal on birch bark. This is Svein Aslifarsson, and he represents perhaps the most insidious Viking evolution of all, the man who's turned raiding into a sustainable lifestyle. The mainstream histories barely mention Svein, dismissing him as a minor Orkney chieftain who died in 1171, supposedly the last Viking. What they miss is that Svein solved the fundamental problem that destroyed most Viking leaders, sustainability. While others burned bright and died young, Svein created a raiding system so efficient, so integrated with normal life, that it lasted over 40 years. He didn't raid for glory or revenge or religion. He raided like a farmer harvests crops, regularly and methodically, because that's just what you do when the seasons change. The quirky detail that never makes it into serious histories. Svein literally scheduled his raids around agricultural seasons. Spring planting, summer raiding, autumn harvest, winter raiding, repeat for 4 decades. His neighbours in Scotland and Ireland could set their calendars by his attacks. Oh, Svein's here. Must be late June. He'd even send advance notice to some regular targets, suggesting they have their tribute ready for pickup to avoid unnecessary unpleasantness. He turned violent extortion into a subscription service. Viking Prime, with guaranteed 2-season delivery. You watch him now, still consulting that almanac, and realize he's not planning raids, he's planning crops, because that's the genius of Sven's system. He never let raiding interfere with farming, and never let farming interfere with raiding. His men aren't professional warriors. They're farmers who happen to excel at armed robbery. They'll help you bring in your harvest in September, then burn your neighbor's farm in October, then be back home in time to prepare their own fields for spring. It's the gig economy, medieval style, where your side hustle involves battle axes. What makes Sven truly dangerous is how reasonable he makes the whole enterprise seem. He doesn't give grand speeches about glory or destiny. He discusses raiding like crop rotation, necessary, seasonal, profitable if done correctly. His innovations are all about efficiency, smaller crews for better profit sharing, regular routes to build customer relationships, moderate violence to ensure repeat business. Why kill everyone when dead people can't produce next year's tribute? Why burn infrastructure you'll need to use again? Historians still argue whether Sven represents the death of Viking culture or its ultimate practical expression. The disturbing part is how his approach makes Viking raiding harder to stop. Heroes like Eric Bloodaxe, you can kill in battle. Conquerors like Sweyn Forkbeard you can negotiate with. But how do you stop someone who treats raiding like a seasonal chore? Sven's raiders don't look like Vikings. They look like your neighbors, because they are. They attend the same markets, worship in the same churches. Sven's nominally Christian, naturally, marry into local families. Then twice a year, they put on their raiding clothes like a uniform and go to work. It's the banality of evil, Nordic edition, right now, as grander Vikings sail off to conquer kingdoms and claim crowns. Sven's checking tidal charts against planting schedules. He's not interested in your kingdom or your crown. He just wants your portable wealth, twice annually, for the next 40 years. While other Vikings dream of dying gloriously in battle, Sven plans to die in bed at age 70, rich and respected, having turned violence into a stable career with excellent work-life balance. He's proof that the Viking age doesn't end with a climactic battle or a final conversion. It ends when the last efficient sociopath realizes that seasonal raiding pays better than farming alone, and nobody can stop him because he's too boring to be worth the effort. That's perhaps the most terrifying evolution of all, the Viking as inevitable as taxes, as regular as rain, as impossible to stop as the turning of seasons. The great Viking assembly has dispersed now, their ships spreading across the waters like spilled blood, each carrying its own particular brand of terror to distant shores. You stand on your beach, watching the last sails disappear over the horizon, and you realize something that makes your bones ache with exhaustion. They'll be back. Not just these particular Vikings, but their sons, their imitators, their spiritual successors. The dragon ships have taught the world a terrible lesson, that the sea is a highway for those brave enough to take it, and civilization is just another resource to be harvested by those strong enough to swing an axe. The morning wind carries the smell of salt and smoke, and you can see fishing boats cautiously emerging from hidden coves where they fled at first sight of those square sails. Life will resume, because it always does, but it will never be the same. Every morning mist might hide approaching raiders. Every strange sail might be death coming to visit. The Vikings haven't just stolen gold and slaves. They've stolen security itself. That comfortable assumption that tomorrow will be much like today, that's gone now, carried away in the holds of dragon ships. Well, you think about what you've witnessed, this parade of evolving horror. Each Viking leader representing a new innovation in the art of bringing misery to the world. From Ivar's strategic brilliance to Svein's sustainable scheduling, from Olaf's weaponized theology to Sigurd's globalized warfare. The mainstream histories will record their deeds in dry prose, counting battles and tallying deaths. But they'll miss the real impact, how these sea kings changed the very nature of fear itself. Before the Vikings, enemies came by land, slowly, visibly. After them, danger comes from any direction water touches, swift as wind, inevitable as tides. But here's the strangest legacy of all. The Vikings won by losing. Their culture was eventually absorbed, Christianized, civilized into extinction. Yet their innovations survived. Every modern navy using mobility and surprise. Every special forces unit conducting surgical strikes. Every corporation raiding market share from competitors. They're all spiritual descendants of those dragon ships. The Vikings taught the world that borders are suggestions, that distance is opportunity, that civilization's complexity creates vulnerabilities for those simple enough to exploit them. Historians still argue whether the Viking Age truly ended or just evolved into forms we don't recognize as Viking anymore. The fishing boats are returning to shore now, and you help pull them onto the beach. The fisherman's eyes keep scanning the horizon, a nervous tick that will be passed down through generations. They're discussing new ways to hide their catch, to bury their silver, to build watchtowers on every headland. The Vikings have made paranoia into a survival skill. Communities that were open will become closed. Trade routes that were free will need guards. Trust, that invisible foundation of civilization, has been damaged in ways that will take centuries to repair. You notice children playing in the sand, and one has fashioned a crude boat from driftwood, complete with a leaf for a sail. He's making rowing motions, calling out commands in a made-up language that sounds harsh and northern. His playmates scatter in mock terror, then beg for turns being the Viking. They're already turning trauma into games, because that's how humans process the unbearable, in 2 generations. These children's grandchildren will tell stories of Viking raids like fairy tales, terrible and distant and almost magical. The blood will be forgotten, but the lesson will remain. The sea brings wonders and horrors in equal measure. The sun climbs higher, warming your face, and you realize you've survived something historians will write about. Not personally. You're too small for history. Just another anonymous victim in the vast saga of Viking expansion. But you've witnessed the pivot point where local raiders became global conquerors, where seasonal piracy became systematic warfare, where pagan brutality absorbed Christian organization and somehow became worse. You've seen the birth of a new kind of warfare that will echo through centuries, taught by men who thought they were just stealing gold, but were actually rewriting the rules of civilization itself. The afternoon stretches before you, deceptively peaceful, as you help your neighbors begin the long work of rebuilding what can be rebuilt and mourning what cannot be replaced. The adrenaline of terror slowly fades into the dull ache of survival, and you find yourself moving automatically through familiar tasks, mending nets, tending wounds, counting who's missing, and trying not to think too hard about where they've gone. The dragon ships are distant specks now, carrying their cargo of stolen lives to markets where humans are just another commodity. But their shadow lingers over everything like a curse. As evening approaches, you climb to the headland where the new watchtower will be built, a community decision made without discussion, because everyone understands the necessity now. From here, you can see for miles across the wine-dark sea, beautiful and terrible in equal measure. Somewhere out there, Ivar is teaching kingdoms to kneel, Sigurd's serpent eye is watching foreign shores, and 100 lesser Vikings are learning that the world is vast and full of plunder. But for now, in this moment, the sea is just the sea, waves rolling endlessly, seabirds calling, fishing boats heading home with the day's catch. You find yourself growing drowsy as the sun sets, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose. The constant vigilance of the day has exhausted you, and your eyelids grow heavy as you watch the rhythm of the waves. Perhaps tomorrow will bring new raiders, new terrors, new tests of survival, or perhaps it will bring only the ordinary challenges of life. Crops to tend, fish to catch, children to raise in a world where dragon ships are always possible, but not always present. Either way, you'll face it, because that's what people do. They endure, they adapt, they transform terror into stories and stories into strength, generation after generation, until even the mightiest Viking becomes just another tale told to drowsy children on quiet nights. The waves whisper against the shore, eternal and patient, and you let their ancient lullaby carry you towards sleep, knowing that when you wake, you'll still be here, still surviving, still human, despite everything the Sea Kings tried to take from you.